The American Civil War, fought from 1861 to 1865, was a brutal and devastating conflict that resulted in the deaths of an unprecedented number of Americans. The death toll is estimated to be between 620,000 and 750,000. The death toll is roughly 2.5% of the total population. This death toll is higher than the combined total of all other American wars, including World War I, World War II, the Korean War, and the Vietnam War, with both Union and Confederate armies suffering heavy casualties. These staggering numbers represent a staggering loss of human life, with families torn apart and communities left in mourning. Imagine a small town where every single man between the ages of 18 and 45 has been taken to fight in the war. Now imagine that nearly half of them never return home, leaving behind devastated widows, orphans, and broken-hearted parents. This was the reality for countless communities across the country as the Civil War claimed the lives of a staggering number of soldiers. The battlefields were scenes of unimaginable horror as men fought and died in brutal hand-to-hand combat. The wounded lay on the battlefields for days without proper medical attention, and many of them died from their injuries. The wounded soldiers that were lucky enough to survive, many of them were maimed, left with missing limbs and other permanent disabilities. The death toll of the Civil War was not limited to the battlefields, as disease also claimed the lives of many soldiers. Camps were overcrowded and unsanitary, leading to outbreaks of deadly illnesses such as dysentery, typhoid, and pneumonia. The death toll of the Civil War was not only limited to the soldiers, but also civilians were affected by the war, as their homes and towns were destroyed, and many were left homeless and destitute. The war left behind a trail of death and destruction that would take the nation years to recover from. The period following the American Civil War, also known as the Reconstruction era, was a time of significant change and upheaval in the United States. The war resulted in the abolition of slavery and the reintegration of former slaves into society as citizens. During the Reconstruction era, the federal government implemented a number of policies and programs aimed at rebuilding the South and integrating African Americans into the political, economic, and social fabric of the nation. One of the major changes that came with the Reconstruction era was the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery and involuntary servitude, except as punishment for a crime. The 14th Amendment granted citizenship to all persons born or naturalized in the United States, including former slaves, and provided equal protection under the law for all citizens. The 15th Amendment prohibited the denial of the right to vote based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. The main debate during the Reconstruction era was how to reintegrate the South into the United States. One of the plans was the 10% plan, which stated that when 10% of the population of a state took an oath of allegiance to the United States and agreed to abide by the Emancipation Proclamation, that state would be readmitted to the Union. The 10% plan was not well received by many radical Republicans who believed it was too lenient on the former Confederate states. There were several proposals and plans being debated in addition to the 10% plan. Some of the most notable proposals include the Wade-Davis Bill. This bill was proposed in 1864 by Republican Congressman Benjamin Wade and Henry Davis. It proposed stricter requirements for Southern states to be readmitted to the Union, including a majority of the white male population taking an oath of loyalty to the United States and ratifying the abolition of slavery. The bill was vetoed by President Lincoln. The Black Codes. These laws were passed by Southern states in the aftermath of the Civil War, with the goal of regulating the behavior of newly freed slaves and limiting their freedom. The Black Codes were widely criticized by Republicans in Congress and were a major factor in the decision to implement federal Reconstruction policies. The Military Reconstruction Act. This act, passed by Congress in 1867, divided the South into military districts and placed the region under the control of the U.S. Army. It also required Southern states to ratify the 14th Amendment and give African American men the right to vote before they could be readmitted to the Union. The Reconstruction Act of 1868. This act was passed by Congress in 1868 as a follow-up to the Military Reconstruction Act. It divided the South into 5 military districts and required all Southern states to ratify the 14th Amendment and give African American men the right to vote before they could be readmitted to the Union. It also required Southern states to hold constitutional conventions and adopt new state constitutions that protected the rights of African Americans. The Amnesty Act. This act, passed by Congress in 1872, offered amnesty to most former Confederate officials and soldiers, with the exception of high-ranking leaders and those who had held certain government positions. The Amnesty Act was intended to help bring an end to the Reconstruction era and pave the way for the return of white democratic control in the South. The Civil Rights Act of 1875. This act, passed by Congress in 1875, prohibited discrimination in public accommodations such as hotels, theaters, and public transportation. It was the last major civil rights legislation of the Reconstruction era, but it was largely ineffective in enforcing the rights of African Americans in practice. All these plans and proposals were part of the ongoing debate on how best to reintegrate the South into the United States and how to guarantee the rights of African Americans. Each of these proposals had different implications for the future of the nation and the rights of African Americans, and the debate over which approach was best continued throughout the Reconstruction era. The assassination of President Abraham Lincoln on April 14, 1865, was a significant event in American history that had a major impact on the country's political and social landscape. Lincoln was shot while watching a play at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. by John Wilkes Booth, a Confederate sympathizer and actor. Lincoln died the next day, becoming the first president of the United States to be assassinated. The assassination of Lincoln was a shock to the nation, as he was a popular president who had led the country through one of its most difficult periods, the Civil War. Lincoln had been re-elected in 1864, and the war was coming to an end with the defeat of the Confederacy. Lincoln was planning to rebuild the country and bring the Union back together. The death of Lincoln changed the course of the Reconstruction era, as his vice president, Andrew Johnson, who became president after Lincoln's death, had a different vision for the future of the nation. Johnson was a staunch advocate for a lenient policy towards the South, and this led to a power struggle between Johnson and Congress, which ultimately resulted in Johnson's impeachment. The assassination also had a profound effect on the nation's psyche, as Lincoln was seen as a symbol of unity and a leader who had guided the nation through one of its most difficult periods. His death was a great loss to the nation, and it was felt deeply by the people. The aftermath of the assassination was marked by a wave of arrests and trials of those suspected of being involved in the plot. Booth was killed while resisting arrest, but several other conspirators were captured and put on trial. 4 of them were found guilty and sentenced to death by hanging. Despite the government's efforts to integrate African Americans into society, many white Southerners resisted these changes and formed groups such as the Ku Klux Klan, which engaged in acts of terror and violence against African Americans and their allies. This resistance manifested in various forms, including the formation of the Solid South, which was a one-party system that existed in the southern states during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, where the Democratic Party was dominant and African Americans were excluded from the political process through discriminatory practices such as literacy tests and poll taxes. These laws were designed to keep the African American population in check and maintain the status quo. Jim Crow laws were state and local laws that enforced racial segregation and discrimination against African Americans from the late 19th century to the mid-1960s. These laws mandated racial segregation in public spaces and institutions, such as schools, transportation, and housing, and also limited the economic and educational opportunities available to African Americans. These laws were a form of institutionalized racism that had a lasting impact. The Solid South began to break down in the mid-20th century as the Civil Rights Movement and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 led to a significant increase in African American voter registration and political participation. This led to the rise of the Republican Party in the South, and by the 1970s, the Solid South was no longer a one-party system. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe.